If I have any time after my 18 minutes, I'll talk to you about swine flu and really lock in the most uplifting presenter award. I hope that you'll remember me in the post-event polling. Sitting here today, we have two futures in front of us, and we still have time, probably, to pick which one we want. The one we saw in the video is one where a nuclear bomb has been used, and if we maintain our present course, it's where we're headed. It might look something like this, which is a small bomb, interestingly enough, sort of a perverse best-case scenario. The epicenter is the theater in which we now sit. This is what a nuclear explosion would look like in Austin. The innermost circle is a mile-wide fireball that's roughly the temperature of the surface of the sun. To recap the blast effects, it causes hundreds of thousands in immediate fatalities. It bankrupts the infrastructure that would be needed to cope with the damage. It causes widespread environmental degradation, spreading somewhere here, no matter or depending on where the wind is blowing. And that's just the immediate blast effects. From there, you've also got what I call economic fallout. Imagine this. Imagine if something like this happened. And try to imagine the psychological backlash. Is there another bomb somewhere? Where could it be? And public outcry causes the ports of the world to shut down, because who knows where the next one's coming from. That ends the global supply chain, and that bankrupts a whole lot of businesses that depend on it flowing very, very smoothly. Add to that the lack of investor confidence in a world where cities can vanish in a day, and you have perhaps the single greatest evaporation of wealth in modern times. That's not the worst part. The worst part is what I call the spiritual fallout. So you've got this economic collapse, and you've got people already living on the margins, and all of a sudden their margin just went away because they didn't have any further down to go. And yet the charitable sector has dried up because there's no more money, and when a bomb like this goes off, nobody's interested in digging wells in Africa anymore. So everything else we care about, every good work that the church is called to, goes off the table. It doesn't matter whether this is Moscow or Mumbai or Manhattan or Austin. This blast is an act of terrorism against humanity itself, because there's not a single square inch and there's not a single person on the planet whose life this doesn't directly impact. I know looking at this that a question that will be raised is, well, isn't that exactly why we have nuclear weapons? To keep the bad guys from doing this to us, so that we can, because we could do the same thing to them and maybe worse if this was enacted upon us. That's the logic of deterrence, and it's the logic that sustained us through the Cold War. And we sort of carried it after the Cold War, which is now nearly 2 decades gone. We carried it into our present time. But the logic of the post-9/11 era, the security logic of the post-9/11 era, is so radically different, and that's what we need to understand, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. And it's the logic of these two futures. So one is this, but leading up to this is this scenario. In 1970, the nations of the world, having seen the handwriting on the wall of how dangerous the world would be if there were multiple nuclear weapon states, made a grand bargain. And the nuclear powers agreed, we will get rid of our weapons someday, and the non-nuclear weapon states said, we won't build them, so we'll hold it down. That was fine during the Cold War. But now the conflict that justified that arsenal, that buildup, has gone away. And we have a two-tier system where you have 9 nuclear weapons powers, and everybody else doesn't have nuclear weapons. And the non-nuclear weapon states are seeing a world in which the nuclear weapon states can pretty much do as they please. They can pretty much run rampant and everybody else has to take it. Well, this creates instability. Because how can, it's like preaching temperance from the atomic bar stool is how you'll hear non-nuclear diplomats talking about it. How can you tell us that these are vital for your security, but we shouldn't have them ourselves? And so someday, when some state really finally says, you know what, they're never going to do it. They're never going to live up to their end of the bargain, referring to us, referring to the Russians, the British, the Chinese, etc. Someday, the proliferation barrier caves, And it won't happen with just one state. If Iran goes nuclear, how far behind can Egypt and Saudi Arabia be? And so on. When this happens, you lose control over the material. Right now, it actually is fairly secure, despite it should be more secure. It should be much more secure. But you lose control of the material, and that results inevitably in a bomb that can't be deterred because it falls into non-state actor hands. That means it's a terrorist group. And that terrorist group can use it with impunity because there's nobody to bomb back. You can't deter against that. You can't deter even with this horrific weapon. And so you see how our own quest for the weapon that will give us ultimate security starts a chain reaction leading to the very process of undermining the goal we sought in the first place. That's why the weapons that we sought to keep us safe, our ace in the hole, have become the greatest threat to all of us. Well, before we collectively sink into a sort of paralyzed, detached despair, there is another option for the really dedicated listeners out there, and it's simply this: a world without nuclear weapons. A world free of nuclear weapons. I know, believe me, I know, the counter-arguments against this, that this could never, ever happen. But here are the sort of tie-dyed utopian hippies who support this idea. George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Bill Perry, and Sam Nunn, the first three Secretaries of State and Defense. Sam Nunn, former chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. An eminent group of global security leaders. 70% of the living former Secretaries of State, Defense, and National Security Advisor. And any number of people who make their business, make their careers in the business of keeping nations safe. It's been percolating in the foreign policy circles for the past couple of years, but it hasn't made its way out into public view yet. They're saying, they've looked at this logic and they've said the only place you can go that doesn't eventually lead to this is a world without these weapons altogether. Now, I know this sounds like a fantasy, and I can't, because of time, go through the exact logic of how all this would happen, how we get to zero. Getting to that end state is work requiring decades. It's the work of a generation, really. There will be setbacks, it will be a long haul, and it will be complicated. But with supporters like this, you owe it to yourself to understand why, what they're thinking, that they could argue this as a plausible case. President Obama, in the clip you saw there on Palm Sunday, outlined this plan, which was Ronald Reagan's dearest vision of a world free of nuclear weapons, and we're started on the road, but we need to be a wind that pushes this process along. Now, just very briefly, the only reason you can talk about abolishing nuclear weapons, I'm going to say this over and over again until we get used to it. The only reason we can talk about abolishing nuclear weapons is because of their very delicate supply chain. You can't make them with things you find in nature. And we're not talking about abolishing crystal meth. I mean, you can't make plutonium in a shed in your backyard. You have to make it in factories that you can see from space. You can't do it in secret. And so if you can control the bomb material, because you can control the bomb material, you can control the bomb. This is why we can even entertain this idea. However difficult it may be, this is why we can say it is possible. It's a long process. We have to count the costs, but I'd say we're a lot like someone clinging to a vine on a cliff. There's a short and easy way down, but if you want to make it to the top, you better be prepared for a long and arduous climb. Well, I've talked so far about a security, outlined a logic of security that's, as I said, been debated back and forth. And I just want to point out that there's not an ounce of Jesus in it. There's not an ounce of Jesus in anything I've just said. An atheist could agree to what I've just said as readily as any Christian, because you don't need a personal relationship with Jesus not to want to be blown up, and you don't and you don't need a personal relationship with Jesus not to want to blow other people up, though it helps, I hope. So the question to us is, what do Christians uniquely bring to the table with this issue? Why talk about this with Christians, which is what I do all the time, thus making myself the most cheerful spouse on the planet? What do Christians have to do with this? And I want to suggest two things: that we bring a unique vocabulary and we bring a unique sense of possibility. The first is vocabulary. If we ran through those statistics again, you could see 60,000 dead, 320 square miles, $1 trillion in damages, the innumerable poor who would die, but all of that's math. And you don't really get at the truth of what you're talking about unless you realize that you're talking about 60,000 lives that are each made in the image of God, done away with in one act. And you don't get at the truth of what we're talking about unless you realize that 320 square miles was shaped by the Creator's hand for our flourishing. And you don't get at the truth of what we're talking about if you look at the devastation that this would wreak on the poor. It would be the greatest friend to injustice of our time. And you don't see the face of Christ staring back, because that's the only way you can realize the kind of evil that we threaten to enact if we continue on this path.